Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Mike Rosenblatt. I'm the co-chair of the Galien Forum, and on behalf of myself and my co-chair, Dr. Philip Sharp of MIT, and Ken Frazier, who's also a host of all of the Galien events over these 2 days, I want to welcome all of you. I thank you all for coming. I just want to briefly say that I think we have the best program that we've ever generated. We're going to be covering a far range of topics from women's health, climate change, immunology, NASH, MASH. We will have our traditional fireside chat, which I will conduct with Nubar Afayan of Flagship Pioneering, and we'll also have our annual CEO panel. So there's a lot packed into this program. For those of you who are planning your day, I just want to point out that there were so many topics to get on the program this year that we've had to have a couple of concurrent sessions. So be careful when you're looking, and unfortunately, we'd love to have them all serially, but you're going to have to make a choice between one or the other at a couple of time frames in the program. So with that introduction, I can see that we've got our women's health panel here, and I'd like to welcome them on stage and turn it over to Julie GERBERDING.
Good morning, everyone. It is absolutely fantastic to be here. And Mike, thank you for the welcome. Ken, for your leadership. Bruno and Raylin, wherever you are, they've been incredibly supportive of pulling this panel together. But I have the wonderful job because I'm sitting here with the most amazing women that you will probably meet during this whole meeting. These women are a wise crowd, including people who've been in the biopharma industry, in academia, in global health, people who've been in the military, people who are running nonprofit organizations, and I could go on. So I'm going to let them tell their stories when we start, but I just want to thank the panel for their willingness to make time for this and to participate in this conversation. One of the most amazing things we just discovered is that two of these women have mothers who were best friends in Nigeria, and the women had never met each other before. Yes. So it's an incredibly small world here at Galien. Thank you. So what I'd like to do is just to maybe start with Beth and go down the panel and have people just say a little bit about their unique perspective, introduce yourself and where you are now, and then what your particular focus on women's health is.
Certainly. So I was, as you heard, born and raised in Nigeria, came to the US at the age of 19 for college. Went to medical school at Harvard as well as did an MPH there, and did all my training there in OBGYN and GYN oncology, and then practiced there for a few more years at the Brigham and the Dana-Farber. I loved what I was doing, but I felt that I needed a bigger impact, right? One patient at a time for me was wonderful, but I felt like I could do more. I wasn't doing much about it, and in comes an email from Merck asking me to maybe think about working on the Gardasil vaccine. So you can imagine I jumped at that, and a few months later I was at Merck on the clinical team with Eliav Bar, my first industry mentor. So I was at Merck for 4 years, and then I've been in several different companies. We don't need to go through all of them. At the moment, or I should say most recently, I was the Chief Scientific Officer for Ferring Pharmaceuticals. And now I've just started a new position as a CEO, but I can't tell you yet what company it is because we're still stealth, but it's very exciting. I'm also the immediate past president of the American Medical Women's Association, and I also do quite a bit of consulting, all in the women's health space, all I've ever done and all I think will ever do.
So a real expert. So Diana.
Hello, I'm Dr. Diana Bianchi. I went to Stanford Medical School. I'm a native of Manhattan, and my training is in pediatrics, medical genetics, neonatology, and all of my research has been in prenatal testing. So I kind of straddle the worlds of obstetrics and gynecology and pediatrics. You'll be hearing about generational health. Generational health is very much what I've been interested in throughout my career. I had a pretty traditional academic career, first at Harvard, then at Tufts, and then got a call from Dr. Francis Collins in 2016 about the possibility of directing the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, one of 27 institutes at the NIH. And I thought, this is an amazing opportunity to really move the needle on women's and children's health globally, really, but with a domestic focus. And at the same time, I can run my own research laboratory, and that is focused on prenatal testing. So it's a privilege to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Sandra THAKUR. I call myself a life science lady. 20 years in life sciences, half of that with many of you in pharmaceuticals, biotech, medical devices. The other half in strategy consulting, where I then advised many of you secretly, never allowed to tell anyone what we were doing, but very much dedicated to making medicines, bringing access to medicines across the world, and innovating across therapeutic areas. Then I went to a startup called Medable, which grew to a very effective and large digital clinical trials company. And finally, after looking and observing the many opportunities at the intersections of life sciences, climate, and health, developed a thesis on investing in generational health. So many of you know generational health, have been working on the science for many years, but the science had not yet transitioned to what would be an investable market. So we took much of the writings of the National Academies of Science, who've been writing about generational health for decades, said, what are those investable intersections that we can effectively move solutions today to support the best multi-generational outcomes, but where we get a premium return in less than a generation? So that is what we do, and I look forward to telling you all more. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is ETIEBET, and as Julie mentioned, I like to say born and bred in Nigeria. But I came here for my medical training and started my practice as an HIV physician, also in academic medicine, doing implementation science research at the University of Maryland. Took that into global health, working really at the implementation front line. You know, what has always driven me is how do we make sure that those innovations, so you know, at the time, that was the heyday of all of the antiretroviral therapy innovations and thinking about how we could get them to the African continent. And so what really drove me was how do we make sure that innovations have the maximum impact for the people that they're supposed to serve. And at that time, women's health, you know, was also something that drove my passion. And I learned from that there were so many ways that you could come at the issue. And I took that knowledge to think through, as Beth mentioned, you know, how can I have multiplier impact and think about coming outside of the exam room, thinking about public health, thinking about public policy, thinking about health systems. That eventually brought me to Merck and Merck for Mothers, which was our global health, or is our global health initiative to help end preventable maternal deaths worldwide. And I was privileged to lead that, you know, for over 5 years and think through how that point of service, you know, that point of engagement with women at this really important time in their life, and oftentimes the only time that they interact with the health system, how can we use that as a stepping stone, as a start to making sure that they can live their healthiest lives? So excited to see everybody here today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sandy Milligan, and I had a very traditional upbringing and career path. Went to George Washington Medical School on an Army scholarship. That's where the Army comes up. I served in the Army as a captain and promoted to major during the first Iraq War. and subsequently went to Georgetown Law School because that's what you just do. And so started out my career practicing some medicine and practicing some law. And eventually found my way to Amgen, where my first job at Amgen was in the law department. So spent a couple of years in the law department and then was persuaded by a gentleman, some of you may recognize Sean Harper, who reported to Roger Perlmutter at the time, to move over to R&D. And that's where I started my journey in research and development. And I would say part of my passion is really interpreting from the clinical science to the regulatory side. So really working in that interface, making sure that there's a smooth landing for the science that's moving through the development programs over to be actually registered, marketed, and available to patients. And so it's been a fantastic career. Went to Genentech for a few years and then came over to Merck and spent about 5 years at Merck and was part of the spin out of Organon, a women's health company. And so those of you that are in startups, if you thought startups are hard, spin outs are harder, I've got to tell you, because spin outs are day one, it's a full running start. You've got commercialized products around the world, studies that are in process. It really is something. I recently transitioned out of Organon and I decided to go small. So I'm at a tiny diagnostic company focused in women's health on ovarian cancer risk stratification as well as endometriosis tests. And I'm proud to say, and one of my first accomplishments there was we just received one of the ARPA H grants for $10 million. So very excited, and that's going to help us move along our tests. Thank you.
So there you have it, incredible women and incredible passion and incredible contribution. When we were talking about this panel, we realized that this is a very broad topic and we're going to need to focus it. But we are going to consider women's health really from 4 dimensions. One is women's health in terms of things that only women have to deal with, the diseases of reproductive organs, of pregnancy, of endometriosis, et cetera. Then there are the conditions that are more common in women than in men, and that of course includes a lot of the rheumatologic diseases, Alzheimer's diseases, et cetera. And then thirdly, those conditions that present differently in women, for example, coronary artery disease, very, very different clinical manifestations and clinical presentations. But then the 4th dimension of this is sort of the lifespan moving into the generational dimensions. So as you can see, we have experts in all of those areas, and what we're going to do is start with a fairly narrow aperture and gradually open it up throughout our discussion. We will be having time for questions and answers at the end, so keep that in mind if you're thinking about things as we go along. We're going to start with the kind of basic discovery, science, research sort of dimension, move out a bit into the R&D and why this is so challenging and why the market is not making this an easy thing. I think Sandy will be particularly articulate in that space. And then we'll talk a little bit more broadly than that about access and uptake and what we need to do to really move this needle on the dial. I'll just frame this with the recognition that 30 years ago was the first NIH director who was a woman, Bernadette Healy, and she initiated the Office of Women's Health Research at the NIH. So for 30 years, the NIH has had a mandate to be inclusive of women and women's issues in research, and a lot of progress has been made, but clearly not enough progress because the disparities, even in the US, continue to be incredibly glaring, and we have a lot of work to do. So this past year, the First Lady, Jill Biden, initiated a Women's Health Initiative, and that has generated a lot of conversation about strategy, prioritizing investments, and what do we really need to do to get this wheel moving again in the right direction. So Diane, I'm going to start with you because you're at the NIH and you are a passionate champion, also an incredible scientist, and maybe you can start us off from the research perspective. Why is this hard and why has progress not been as fast as we would have liked it to have been?
Thank you, Julie. And before we begin, we decided that we want to make sure that we're inclusive, and yet we're also very mindful of the time. So we're going to say women's health, and that is encompassing people born with a reproductive set of organs that would be female, no matter how they identify later on in their lives. So we're just going to use women's health as a shorthand, but we are inclusive of everyone. And the NIH has overall approximately a $42 billion budget, of which over 10% can clearly be identified as women's health, which isn't a whole lot. On the other hand, we need to do better in terms of identifying what exactly is women's health. And we're working on that as part of the First Lady's Women's Health Research Initiative. There is a publicly available database that you all can go to and track either a specific disease or ultimately, hopefully in the next year, if you want to know how much the NIH is spending on women's health, you can go there and then link specific grants to areas of interest. We are somewhat separate from ARPA-H. Sandy, congratulations. But ARPA-H is a separate initiative established by President Biden. It does use some of the infrastructure of NIH. The Office of Research of Women's Health does not give grants. Virtually every one of the 27 institutes at NIH funds research. My institute, the National Institute of Child Health, does not fund all of the child health research. In fact, we are the major funder of maternal health research. And for many years, we have supported networks where we can do implementation research. Many of the grants are related to pregnancy, and I think you must realize that we have a maternal health crisis in this country, and that is putting a focus on paying attention to women's health, but women's health is much broader than that. However, 90% of women during their lifetime have at least one pregnancy, so it's helpful to think about how pregnancy affects later health, and it is an opportunity because women, people born female, are in contact with their care providers frequently during pregnancy. But we always say that pregnancy is a stress test for later health, and if you develop gestational diabetes, for example, you're more likely to develop diabetes, type 2 diabetes later in life. So it's an opportunity to intervene and to develop both diagnostics and therapeutics. But I want to assure you that your tax dollars are currently going to good use in terms of supporting women's health research. We need to do better. And the focus of this past year, looking at women's health from the perspective of both these conditions that are unique to women, conditions that present differently in women, and conditions that are more common in women, are the focus currently of our work. So
I just want to follow up, Diana. You mentioned pregnancy as a stress test for future diabetes, or gestational diabetes being a risk factor for future diabetes. But we're beginning to really see this whole spectrum of illnesses as a life cycle, life stage event. For example, if you really look at the Alzheimer's research, you discover that we don't really know very much about what happens to the brain in pregnancy, but it's beginning to look like the hormonal influence of pregnancy influences the brain in permanent ways. And then when you go through the stress of losing that hormonal stimulus, you have the clinical observation of Alzheimer's. So that life cycle evaluation of the science is really difficult when you're dividing the NIH into various domains and compartments. How do you bring that integrated view?
yeah, and I would say that it actually begins in childhood, that with the development of the reproductive organs, there are many things that can go wrong, and there are many things that influence later health. But you're absolutely right, Julie. Pregnancy, as we've learned in the past year, changes the structure of the brain. How amazing is that? You know, people talk about mommy brain. I mean, it's real. The actual structure changes. And if you have had complications of pregnancy, such as hypertension, for example, you're much more likely to get Alzheimer's later on. So you really do need to take this lifelong perspective.
Well, maybe we can jump to you, Sanskriti, because this really does speak to the broader generational perspective. I know we're going a little bit out of the aperture sequence, but I think that fits into this conversation.
Yeah, certainly. I think that we all began the journey on generational health thinking, why haven't we opened the aperture on women's health? Are we separating our bodies from our environment? Don't toxins in our environment affect us? Don't epigenetic shifts throughout our childhood into our adulthood affect the next generation? And what we know and what we're finding is that it's not just the next generation, but it's the fourth plus generation. So it's not just our healthcare and life sciences investments, but it's our investments in removing the top 10 toxins from our environment that matter as well. And these chronic diseases we are observing that without these activities in generational health, which is, I would say, broader than a life science investment, we look at investments at the intersections of climate, health, and technology, where they're underserved, underinvested, undervalued, because oftentimes they're associated with, a generational or reproductive outcome. Beyond just being, underinvested, I would say that when we look at our $17.4 billion of generational health companies that we evaluate and think about what are the right ones, almost 45% of those are directly relevant to women's health, but the largest majority of them also don't get the funding they need at these early stages, even in the discovery stage, before they become Series A, Series B companies, and then become targets of the pharmaceutical industry. So the question is why? It's not that they're not effective. It's not that they don't have good fundamentals. It's often because perhaps we're not looking in the right places. Our traditional investment allocations in life sciences have created siloed types of investment. So in our model, we've broken those silos. And we said you have to look at this as an alternative strategy, where investing in something that might sit at the border of chemicals and life sciences is a meaningful investment, because the outcomes for women, the outcomes for men, and together the outcomes multi-generationally are scientifically known and understood, but haven't been addressed. People ask me all the time, well, how are we going to make a return on this? Are you going to measure this for 4+ generations? No, of course we're not going to measure it for 4+ generations. The scientists have already determined that epigenetic shifts can pass along, right? That certain toxins in our environment move through our bodies to men and women and pass on to their 4+ generation. We try to ensure that we invest in the right things that can be adopted with the right returns. But it certainly should be an eye-opener, I think, for how people define women's health and define the role of women's health as 51% of this population to reshaping how we're going to evolve as a community.
Thank you. And you're mentioning, the challenges of getting investment positioned in a way to facilitate problem solving. But Sandy, you're involved in something right now in your startup company, which is really understanding why it's hard even to do the research and development and to move things through the regulatory process. So let's talk about that end of translation a bit.
Absolutely. So I think just picking out a particular disease, one that affects women because of biology, endometriosis. And when I was head of R&D at Organon, we did bring in a molecule for research and development in endometriosis, and now the company I'm at, Aspira Women's Health, is in the area of diagnostics for endometriosis. What's been fascinating to watch, so this is a disease that affects 10% of the women around the world. It can have serious impacts on their day-to-day life, whether it's social, whether it's economic, work life, and in the end, approximately 50% of women showing up to the fertility clinic have endometriosis, either diagnosed or undiagnosed to that point. Very serious disease, lifelong effects. What's interesting is in order to do an endometriosis clinical trial, you must enroll patients who have diagnosed endometriosis. That makes perfect sense. But the only diagnostic modality that we have currently is laparoscopic surgery. So every woman who is enrolled in an endometriosis clinical trial must have been diagnosed laparoscopically. So as you proceed with your clinical trial, because you can't force women to go back and get a second laparoscopic surgery to see if the disease is extended or regressed, you have to measure patient-reported outcomes, pain endpoints. So the drugs get approved with all this research investment, all this development, all this hope that is going to slow down or regress the disease, and the endpoint is pain. How do payers feel about pain endpoints? Not really positively. Very, very hard. A lot of step-through therapies. Why do you need to be on this expensive new drug for pain if you can take Tylenol or Advil? Very, very difficult development path. Flip over to the diagnostic. So what would be one of the solutions? A diagnostic. Fantastic. So the challenge is I need to discover a diagnostic that works, right? That identifies women with endometriosis, no matter where that endometriosis is, no matter what stage. But I also need, in order to be compensated for the diagnostic, I need to demonstrate that the decision that the physician will make on treatment is determined by the outcome of that diagnostic. So even though a patient may have symptomatology of endometriosis, and I may or may not be able to confirm it with a diagnostic, hopefully confirm, it may not get paid for because it may not change the therapeutic decision-making because the therapeutic options are so narrow. And some payers would like me not only to change the physician's viewpoint on their therapeutic journey for the patient, they want me to demonstrate the outcome. Those are pretty high hurdles, pretty high hurdles. We have an ovarian cancer diagnostic risk stratification tool where I had one payer inform me that he really wanted me to demonstrate it, that using the diagnostic to determine whether or not a woman was at high risk or low risk for ovarian cancer would change PFS and OS at the end. Well, how unique. I'm not the therapeutic. I'm just the diagnostic. So there are a lot of challenges, and I do worry quite a bit, especially in women's health, because it's a disease that's so heterogeneous, endometriosis, PCOS, some of the other diseases that we're experiencing. We don't have specific, direct, druggable targets, and it's making it very difficult to bring forward solutions that have lasting impact on women.
So that's a very sobering outlook, and I think your illustration with endometriosis is replicated in several other conditions, even menstrual cramps. They're women's sexuality. There are all of these areas where, from a woman's perspective, there are major unmet needs, but the system doesn't really operate in a way to make it a viable opportunity from a market perspective.
Julie, can I say something about the market? Because I do think one of the things I'd love for folks to think about is an expansive view of the market. I do know that for much of the investment in this area, we're thinking about the US, we're thinking about Europe, we're thinking about high-income countries. But some of what I have witnessed is the ability to leapfrog and think differently about some of those kind of baseline criteria when you are working in lower income markets. And I'm not saying we are lowering our standards around the science, but because of the different context and the different conditions, we do have to think, I think, more creatively about some of those endpoints and outcomes. And before we can do that, we do know that we have to understand, generally, how large these markets are. We need to understand how many women are there, what are they dying of, how are they living, and have those fundamental data systems, which in many places don't exist. But through private-public partnerships, including, some we've had between, Merck for Mothers, investing, from a more philanthropic perspective in some of the early stage research, having that now been taken up by impact investors and taking, for example, the Lydia device to the next level, and then it being ready to meet, the standards for the broader life sciences companies. So I think that's something to really think about as we want to, generate more investment in this space.
That's a really important point. One of the things I became aware of when we were preparing for this panel is that 3 of the people participating in this panel have had a tremendous impact on maternal mortality. And I'm going to ask Diana to speak from her perspective in global work on the infectious contribution to maternal mortality. And both Beth and Marianne can speak on the contribution of bleeding to maternal mortality, because Ferring was a very big part of another very broad global study that had a tremendous impact. And just now, my association with the Foundation for the NIH was beginning to work on preeclampsia and eclampsia as the 3rd leg of that mortality stool. So, but I'd like to hear from Diana maybe about the A+ study, and then talk a little bit about heat-stable carbetocin and what we've learned about. Just following up on your point, Marianne, really about what we can do to truly move the needle on the dial.
Thank you, Julie. So we do have a maternal health and maternal mortality crisis in the United States, but the NICHD, the institute that I direct, has a global health research network with 8 sites in 7 different low and middle income countries. And we were fortunate to partner with the Gates Foundation and the Foundation for NIH to implement the A+ study, which was testing whether or not if you gave a 2-gram oral dose of azithromycin to women in labor in these low and middle income countries, would you reduce maternal sepsis and mortality? And we also had a secondary aim of looking at the infants. The study had to be stopped early because it showed that 1/3 of the women, there was 1/3 less incidence of sepsis and death. And so there was an obligation to begin to offer the azithromycin as a regular antibiotic during labor to save lives. So there's a clear endpoint there rather than pain, as Sandy was mentioning. Death is pretty clear. The babies did not show an effect, but they only had a very brief exposure to the antibiotic. But it shows that you can have an effect. This was just a very exciting result, and the fact that it had to be stopped early.
Thank you. So should we talk about carbetocin?
You can start. I think this is another great example of partnerships both across life sciences and between life sciences and the public sector. And so many of you will know postpartum hemorrhage is the #1 killer of women during pregnancy and childbirth. And about over 95% of those deaths, again, are occurring in low and middle income countries. But we have seen, as Diana mentioned, not just a rising tide of maternal mortality in the US, but the gaps in who is unfortunately dying. We're seeing huge racial disparities in that. I think you have probably not been able to avoid the news recently, about the impact on, some of our reproductive rights, here in this country, and that leading to documented deaths, during pregnancy and not being able to access post-abortion, abortion care or just general reproductive health care during miscarriage or after miscarriage. And I bring that up because I do think it's important that you mentioned only about 10%, of investment is going into this space. We do need to make sure that we are investing in this space and we are not excluding certain things, from our investigations. But back to your question, Julie, about heat-stable carbetocin. We knew, that carbetocin had an impact in terms of postpartum hemorrhage, but the formulation, that it had been registered for wasn't one that was suitable, for low and middle income countries. And so Merck for Mothers and Ferring, in partnership with WHO, and Mike here, was part of that effort and that catalyzing that partnership to develop clinical research trials across 9 low and middle income countries to prove the point that heat-stable carbetocin does in fact, reduce rates of postpartum hemorrhage and increases survival. And that would not have been possible without the partnership between Merck for Mothers, who funded the trial, WHO, who developed the clinical trial sites, and Ferring, that is the manufacturer and holder of the drug. But what was so exciting about that is at the beginning, we, and Beth, I'd love for you to speak to some of this, thinking through, as I mentioned at the beginning, how do we make sure that this innovation is going to have impact? And so thinking from the beginning about access, and thinking about the beginning from access pricing, and thinking from the beginning about how we would actually get that drug to bedside. And those were just some of the things that we worked on in partnership.
Yes, that's true, and indeed, this is a very exciting project that's been going on for quite some time. Ferring continues to provide its heat-stable carbetocin, and that's so important just because in the United States we use oxytocin, and that can be that has to be frozen. And of course, if you look at most of the world, that's just not possible, right? So that heat stability is what's really, really important here. Ferring has several partnerships around the world, including in Nigeria. We call this Safe Birth, the program, which continues to grow. And more recently, there's a partnership between Ferring and the Maternity Foundation to really further this effort and get it to even more women. We've also now, Ferring developed an app that is used. We tend to think of people in developing countries, low-income countries, not necessarily having devices and using devices, but it is a very good way to keep in touch. So very exciting and a really great thing that Ferring has done.
Could I add one thing? One of the things that you may not be aware of is the fact that I mentioned the Global Health Research Network. We have a number of existing networks, clinical trial networks, that provide the infrastructure, and we're very open to public-private partnerships that can be facilitated through the Foundation for NIH. We also are increasingly offering challenges where for startups, we can offer prizes. It's very much like Shark Tank, where there are prizes given at different stages. And in fact, we have an ongoing challenge right now to develop diagnostics for endometriosis, as Sandy mentioned. On average, it takes women 7 to 10 years to be diagnosed because ultimately they have to go to that laparoscopy surgery. So it's very important for you to recognize that you can leverage government resources to de-risk development of devices and new therapies.
So I must add to this as well. Investors are not exempt from these efforts, right? I think one of the things that is been typically true is that I don't think investors have spent just enough time in front of some of these bigger global programs because their interests are so focused perhaps on 1 or 2 or 3 companies. But to exemplify this, we've partnered with the World Economic Forum in the first Women's Health Investment Consortium. And not to replicate the science that all of you are doing, but the reality is across the world in lower middle income countries, how we approach people matters. How we speak to them about family planning, how we integrate the products and treatments into their culture is why they will adopt it. So we create wonderful medicines that women may even have access to and may be reimbursed, but culturally, there's a barrier. And I think we have to make sure that we're addressing how we interact with communities, how we bring treatments into communities in multiple ways, because it has to pull through for us to get that health outcome that we want, but also it has to pull through so that we're reshaping how people feel they are treating themselves over time.
Thank you. Do you want to add, Beth?
Yes, just to come back, I think, to the endometriosis issue, because it's such a clear, example of exactly what we're facing in women's health. You just mentioned, actually, the fact that it does take sometimes almost a decade for a woman to get a diagnosis of endometriosis. And it's not, there's obviously the laparoscopy piece, but that comes often very much later, after several years of women having to go from doctor to doctor to doctor who will actually listen, right? First of all, it often takes women quite a while to even get to a doctor to decide they can go to talk about what they're dealing with. So I think we need to think about that aspect of things too, and the fact that our physicians, unfortunately, even physicians who are in the women's health space, because we don't understand the science of these conditions, right? We don't understand. We don't know where endometriosis comes from. We don't know why it develops. We don't know. There's just so much we don't know. Because of that, we don't have the therapies that we need, right? You think about what oncology has done and how it's targeted therapy now. We have almost none of that in the women's health space. So we've got a lot of work to do when it comes to the science behind it. And I think that once we sort of get that through, it's going to take a while, we can then have targeted therapies that we can offer to people. And this is the reason, it's so important, because physicians, although oftentimes they want to help, and it's so clear in the endometriosis setting, if they have nothing to offer to that patient, unfortunately, they're going to push her to the next person. So these patients jump around for years and years and years before they finally find someone who says, let's do that laparoscopy, right? And that's what leads to this very long time. And we see this in a number of different conditions as well. So I think getting the science together, right, which I think we're going to talk about more, but also helping women in particular to get past that stigma of even going to the doctor in the first place. So a lot of issues to think about.
And we seem to be focusing on endometriosis, but endometriosis is also very interesting because it's associated with other autoimmune disorders, such as multiple sclerosis, and women who have endometriosis have a higher risk of ovarian cancer, which explains Sandy's interest. So we don't know why these conditions are associated with each other, and it's a good example of some of the challenges of women's health.
And I would agree. I think especially with the prevalence of 10%. Yes. And if you think about a sister disease for women, polycystic ovarian syndrome, it affects a different 10% of women. So now you're talking about 20% of the women suffering from a chronic disease with multiple symptomatology and no real treatment. And polycystic ovarian syndrome is profound. It's profound. And women are treated symptomatically. Oh, you're a little fuzzy here, so we'll use some hair removal. Oh, your diabetes, we'll treat the diabetes. Oh, this. And so you see women with stacked medications trying to control the symptoms of polycystic ovarian syndrome, but not the actual etiology of the disease itself. And just recently, there was a scientific publication that suggested that women with polycystic ovarian syndrome have a much higher rate and earlier presentation of dementia, basically, in later life. And so these are not just diseases of your fertile years. These are diseases that have impact throughout your lifespan. So we really need to do something different than just throwing symptomatic meds at women for these diseases that are so chronic and so debilitating.
I just wonder, from the standpoint of, again, turning that crank, getting this going, what is the status of participation, willingness to participate in trials? I mean, obviously, if laparoscopy is a barrier, so we can kind of set that aside, but access to clinical trials, and how are we doing in terms of achieving greater equity, and who has the ability to even contribute to the research agenda?
Well, you raise a good point. So if the global trial has a requirement, because FDA, US registration is first, and the requirement is laparoscopic surgery, to Marianne's point, laparoscopic surgery is not always going to be available to everyone globally. So how do you run a global study when the entry criteria is so high? It's so challenging. And I think that it's, women do want to participate. We do see them wanting to raise their hand to participate, but we also have to be mindful, especially as these are childbearing years for a lot of these diseases, to some of the other discussion points, how do we make it easy for women to participate in clinical trials? And we're not doing a great job in that aspect. These are usually academic centers. They're tough to get to. I mean, no one wants to drive to Manhattan from Pennsylvania to participate in a clinical study. So how can we enable women to participate, maybe with their community physician? And there's a lot of work that's been going on with that, with wearables and decentralized trials, but really decentralized trials are not the norm. They're just not the norm.
I should just mention, since many here may not know this yet, since it's actually being launched at a small scale, but NIH has launched a program called Care for Health, which is the expansion of the ability to participate in clinical trials in rural areas. So a few hubs have been funded in this very small first cycle, but the expectation is that this will grow, and investing in the infrastructure and the capacity to improve availability, particularly in the hard-to-reach areas and hard-to-reach communities. Obviously, for anyone who's ever done a clinical trial, you know that there has to be a there in order for that to be a viable program. But rather than the NIH coming in and prescribing, here's what you need to do to be eligible, you have to do it this way, what they've really done is say, you tell us. You know, you, primary care network in rural community X, tell us what are the important areas of research that you wish you would be able to participate in your community or with your patient population, and to kind of customize the infrastructure development according to the need and the desires of the community. That doesn't seem like a hard concept, but that's not the way we usually work. So I think it's kind of a breakthrough, and I don't know what you think about it, Diana, because I know it's just early days. But
well, the main emphasis of Care for Health is really to incorporate primary care providers and get them into the mindset that every patient is a potential participant in a clinical study. With an emphasis on rural health, because people who are in rural areas have a hard enough time getting health care. And don't get me started about the movement of OBGYNs out of certain states, and the maternity care deserts, the lack of care providers. That is a huge issue now.
I think that's such an important point, because medical training, think about how we've been training our best physicians. I think one of the ripest areas actually for innovation right now have been our views of new medical training technologies, way to bring global communities together and train medical doctors. There's obviously a market for that. But even beyond that, I mean, clinical trials, we don't even understand like the difference between a female cell and a male cell in many cases, and the difference in the receptors on those cells, and the ways that those cells are communicating. And so one of the investments we're thinking about making is in a company that's mapping uniquely the XX biome, looking at cells across the female body and saying, what is in fact different about the cell, the DNA within the cell, and how it interacts from a male cell, which should be fascinating for us as we consider clinical trials and identifying discovery targets for scientific treatment.
Just one point on clinical trials as it relates to women that some of you may not know is that we only started to allow women to join clinical trials in 1993. So you could, yes, 1993. Before that, women were not allowed to be in clinical trials because we felt we needed to protect them, which we obviously do when it comes to pregnancy and so on. However, what that means is that many of the drugs that are out there on the market, even still, were never tested in women. So a great example of this, and why it is so important to have women in your trials and to disaggregate data, which the NIH needs and wants people to do. It's basically you must do it, and yet people get away without it for some reason, which is another discussion. But the 1993 thing, the drug Ambien, which many of you know, was developed with no women in the trials. The dose that came out in the trials and was approved by the FDA was a 10 milligram dose. Women were taking this and falling over and just having terrible problems. Why? Because that dose was way too high for them. It was figured out then post the first approval that women needed half, right? So there are now 5 milligram tablets for Ambien, but that's what happens, right? These are the challenges when we don't include women in clinical trials. So it is and to your question as to whether it's going well, I think it is. Where it's not is women of color, marginalized societies and communities. That is, exactly. There are major trust issues when it comes to the pharma industry. So we have a lot of work to do there.
I just want to follow up on this in that you mentioned pregnancy. And there are a number of tentative forays into drug treatment for women during pregnancy. I just wonder how the panel sees that, that evolution and where do you think it's going to go?
Well, there's not enough research right now. I mean, we know from the 21st Century Cures Act, which mandated that the NIH take an approach to looking at research in pregnant and breastfeeding women. And so over several years, we found that while there was some data on drugs that, for example, would delay preterm labor, things that were very specifically related to pregnancy, there was virtually no data on taking an asthma medication during pregnancy. And the prevailing wisdom was don't take anything. That's the safest way to be. And we're actually harming women and their babies by doing that because we don't have the evidence. So one of the things we've been trying to do is study the pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics of certain medications in pregnant and breastfeeding women. Breastfeeding, there's virtually no data at all. And in the limited number of drugs that we have studied so far, we've shown that almost nothing gets into the baby. So we've been fortunate that we have women in a trial called the Cuddle study, and they are providing samples of their breast milk. They are giving a blood sample. The baby's giving a needle stick, and we're measuring how the drug is being metabolized and transferred, if at all, to the baby. And it's not getting into the baby. So women are being told, don't take this medicine because it's going to harm the baby, which is at risk for their own health, and yet it's not getting into the baby because of lack of evidence. We don't.
And that gets translated to earlier research, for instance, in preterm labor. We were picking up development from Aspira on a product for preterm labor that was going to be delivered to the mom to stop preterm labor, not prevent. So at the very, very end of pregnancy. And the hope was there would be an exposure of 24 to 48 hours, and that would be enough for the mom to get to a tertiary center and deliver. The regulatory requirements in the US were extraordinary. A 2-year infant study before registration.
Wow.
To measure what? To your point, what would be the impact to the infant of 2 days of exposure for a medication that had already gone through all the preclinical development? It's impossible. It's just impossible. And I think that we have to be more rational. And now this is just one of the musings I have coming from Merck, a vaccine company, and thinking about the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, I think it is. Can we stimulate more research and development in the area of maternal and fetal health if there was also a similar compensation fund? Because right now there is going to be a resistance to take on the burden and the investment in some of these areas if there isn't a more diffuse way of absorbing that liability. And I just worry that we're at a snail's pace. We're just at a snail's pace, and we might have some good outcomes in knowing what existing meds we can use in pregnancy, but I just think the progress is just hindered by concern, and I don't want to say overprotectionism because that's not fair, but just we need a more logical way to get to the end result in a quicker fashion.
You're talking about one dimension of how the government can potentially de-risk or be helpful in motivating participation. And I think the vaccine compensation program is an exemplar of that. We've also been talking with NIH a bit about a similar mechanism for rare diseases. How do we get the investments that we need for rare diseases where the current approach to regulatory approval just doesn't even make any sense? And FDA is, of course, very involved in this as well. So I just wonder, from a rare disease, women get rare diseases. They get a lot of them. And we haven't really found a way to bring those diseases into the treatment domain because of the lack of investment, I would say, and in the sense where there's market failure, the government potentially could really play a role. And I'm not saying NIH should do that, but I'm thinking, broadly speaking, how do we motivate more focus on the rare diseases?
Just a point on the pregnancy and investment, I think is worth noting. Private industry, and I was quite surprised by this in fundraising, I would say. People across the country who provide private funds have asked me specifically not to invest in assets to support pregnancy or family planning because of their beliefs. And, I think it's important people know this, that even today, because race, religion, and politics is not focused on humanity, it's focused on other things, that private capital is at the whim of people who hold it, and those people tend to be billionaire-ish men. So we've had to say, no, we're not going to take all of your money, and because we have to be able to take private capital and infuse it into maternal care and services for girls and supporting telemedicine where we don't have community hospitals because we're shutting it down. But it feels like the stacks are all against us then, because then we lose the opportunity to take that capital and put it in other areas of women's health. So wanted to share that.
Thank you. We've kind of been talking about a lot of challenges, and there are many and many more we haven't touched on yet. But I would love to hear, what are you excited about? Where's your source of optimism, and where do you think we can make great progress? We've proven we can do it, but what are you optimistic about? And maybe you can't tell us because you're in stealth mode right now.
Yes, but I am extremely optimistic, and I'll tell you why. We've talked a lot about the underinvestment in women's health, right, over the decades. But it's changing now, right? It really is. Somebody mentioned, I forget who, Jill Biden's initiative, and then the executive order that was signed by Joe Biden in February of this year, calling on Congress to spend at least $12 billion for women's health research. That is a huge, huge number. And of course, with the new administration coming in, we are going to have to push really hard to get that money, right? But indeed, there is now I'm going to call it a community, I'm going to call it a movement, I'm not sure what to call it, of women's health advocates. That includes investors, that includes entrepreneurs, that includes advocates. And we are all coming together. We've been talking. One of these is, I think, an outcome of that movement that's happening, and we plan to really sort of change the landscape, right? And a big part of this is investment, and I'm seeing investors showing interest, a lot of interest. Of course, much of the investment, and if you read some of the stuff that's out there about all the increasing investment in women's health, yes, it's happening. Most of it is still in the space of apps, care delivery, that sort of stuff, really important stuff. We have very little happening in the therapeutic space. Why? Because we don't have the fundamental science that we can use to develop targeted therapies that you talked about. But we're getting there. There's more and more of that happening. And I encourage any one of you who's here, potentially as an investor thinking about this, talk to any of us. We can tell you about what's happening. I think that the future is bright.
Thank you for that, Diana.
Yeah, I think what's different now is that women's health has become part of the national conversation. I mean, never in my lifetime did I ever imagine that reproductive health specifically, but women's health in a broader sense, would be part of an election conversation. And the more women that we have in Congress, for example, the more emphasis there is on women's health. So in addition to your day jobs, you all have the opportunity to communicate with your representatives to indicate how important women's health is and that we need more investment from a research perspective. I'm excited that at NIH we're taking an NIH-wide approach to many of the important problems, whether it's addiction, for example, or if it's hypertension. We are working together with our colleagues across NIH to leverage our resources. But I just want to share an optimistic story in the space that my own research is in, and that's in prenatal testing for fetal genetic disorders. In the space of a little over a decade, that has translated from bench research to clinical tests that are offered to all pregnant people. In the United States, many of you may have had this cell-free DNA testing, which is highly accurate as a screen. It's turned into a $4 billion research. And we've recently shown that not only do these fragments of DNA from the fetus and the placenta give you a very effective screen for Down syndrome, for example, there are fragments from tumors that if you have a silent cancer, you can pick them up with this type of testing as well. So the next frontier will be to see whether this test functions as a liquid biopsy. So this is something that's happened, as I said, in the last decade and a half. So there can be successes.
And I'll just point out, in case it isn't obvious, that Dr. Monica Bertagnolli is the director of the NIH, the second woman to lead the NIH. But in addition, many of the institute directors are now women. I was so struck by my introduction to my new job to go to my first meeting of NIH Institute directors, and I just couldn't believe the change. It was just a dramatic change. But that's true across HHS. More and more of the senior leadership positions are being filled by women, and I think that's helping to change the conversation and hopefully contributing to this momentum that you were talking about, Beth. So you haven't been there that long to maybe notice the same difference, but when I was in government, it was a really rare phenomenon to see a woman at that table.
No, I think when I started 8 years ago, I was one of 4, and now almost half of the directors are women. And it makes a big difference in terms of speaking up and also being supported by your colleagues.
Thank you.
Well, I would like to see more investors that are women. I'll start with that. So I'm very optimistic. I think it's very clear globally that women's health is a key lever for generational health. I also am inspired when we work with countries who think about, make that connection about their global productivity. Women are empowered, they're making consumer-based decisions, they're leading household decisions, their productivity is an outcome of their health. Scientifically, we are so excited about mitochondrial modulators and brain health, which in some areas are going to support treatments that are disproportionately affecting women. We're excited about the growth in equities and venture investment in epigenetics, so that about 300% in 2024. Very unknown area of research and science that we're planning on investing in and really important to our understanding of multi-generational outcomes. And of course, I'm excited to see more women as CEOs of these companies, designing and thinking about how these treatments are going to be adopted by other women and men. So I think we're headed to a good place.
We're headed there, but we're going slower than I would like. I am optimistic, Julie, to use your notion of the aperture, that we are increasing the aperture in terms of who we are looking at and whose needs we are investigating, who we're pulling into clinical trials. You know, Beth, you mentioned we don't have enough women of color in clinical trials, and even broader, you know, thinking about this from a global perspective. And I do think that the more diverse women that we can bring into the science, the more opportunities that we will find, and not just, you know, for investors, but for improving the health of women. So I'm excited about that, and all of you here today also makes me excited.
So what I've noticed over the past 4 or 5 years is that I think that there's a better understanding of what women's health really is. If you had asked folks 4 or 5 years ago about women's health, I think it would have been a more diffuse definition. And 4 or 5 years ago, you also saw a lot of investment in femtech, as if femtech was the answer to endometriosis and PCOS and some of the more serious diseases. And I'm very optimistic that menopause could be controlled by an app, but I'm a little bit doubtful at the same time. So, you know, give me hormones or give me death. But it was disappointing to see how much money was invested in a little bit of the magic oil. And, you know, seeing claims of just use this twice a day and you'll feel younger and more beautiful and sexier. And you're like, wow, what is that? I won't share unless it's a cocktail, because it's not suitable for the stage. But I think that investors have been able to better define and understand women's health. I think that looking at just the way medicine's practiced in that interface of gynecologists or OBs or general doctors, I think has also helped. There's different phases of the day that each gynecologist is facing, whether it's in-office delivery of healthcare, you know, pap smears and breast exams, in the labor and delivery unit, which is a whole nother area for improvement, or in the OR, where we're still using tools that were invented 100 years ago. So I think that there's a lot of areas of improvement, and you do see more interest in not just diseases that are specific to women, but diseases that disproportionately affect women, or diseases that differently affect women. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's really exciting to see.
Well, I feel very optimistic now, so that's a relief after our earlier conversation. But I would like to now open this up for any questions or comments from the audience. And I think we have one. Do we have a microphone scooting here? Thank you.
Julie and panel, you're not going to be surprised that I'm going to ask a question about osteoporosis, probably the most common female disease. We've been talking about pregnancy and lactation for part of this. You know, when a woman biosynthesizes a baby and then breastfeeds her later, she transfers a huge amount of calcium from herself, from her own bones, into the bones of the baby. And if and that's a huge drain. And if she doesn't take calcium supplements or have calcium in the diet, that's going to lead to osteoporosis later. I don't know that it's a topic of research, but it's certainly a topic of education and public health, and maybe even research on education. How do you make people aware to the threshold that they actually do something about it? So I'm wondering whether any of you have knowledge about programs that are particularly directed for the intervention that can be done at that time of life that will protect a woman much later in life.
I don't have an answer to that question, Mike, but I can tell you that the biomarker work in osteoporosis has reopened the interest in exploring the discovery pipeline, because we don't have to now do 10-year studies looking for hip fractures. We can use validated biomarkers to shorten the duration of follow-up and the number of people that have to be enrolled in the trial to get to an endpoint. So one of the big barriers to understanding this question has been eliminated because of the biomarker work.
And you'll be reassured to know that as part of the Women's Health Research Initiative, osteoporosis was identified as one of the 7 areas, as was endometriosis and other gynecologic disorders. But osteoporosis, because of exactly the same reason that you mentioned, it's really a lifespan issue. And it also has to do with how much calcium you're taking as a teenager, for example. So there are time points across the lifespan that are extremely important, and there is research to be done. So it is one of the 7 areas.
And I'm aware of a couple of companies that are looking for, newer products that are more easily used by women. These are for more post-menopausal women, which is extremely important as well, right? So the current medications are usually injections, and they're looking for an oral. A couple of companies that are looking for oral solutions. So I think there's a lot of focus on osteoporosis for sure.
And I would take your question even more generally about, I think it was Sandy who mentioned, all of the different, actually no, Diana, it was you, hypertension in pregnancy, preeclampsia, things that now make you more susceptible to, other diseases across the lifetime. And we hear time and time and time again that the woman was not informed, that this episode increased her risk for something else. And not only was she not informed, but she wasn't linked to the next provider. And so we need to do more around the education, including of, I'm not an OB-GYN, including the OB-GYNs.
Absolutely.
Who do not, I think for the most part, really think about health of women holistically, and don't provide that type of education, or don't provide those handoffs. And there are lots of exciting I would say more than experiments that are happening around, comprehensive care during pregnancy, but there's more we need to do. And I think we can't just leave it to what happens in the exam room. I think we need more broader public awareness and public health campaigns. And we need to think again more creatively about, for example, in that first postpartum visit, that's an opportunity to screen all women, for cardiac disease, diabetes, mental health. So cancer, and we don't do that.
We have a question over here.
Right here. My name is Toby. I'm the founder and CEO of Dental Find. It's an AI marketplace where people can purchase dental care services like cleanings and whitenings, and then it helps the dentist acquire patients. There was a lot of talk around the lack of funding for women's health solutions, and specifically SANS. You mentioned the lack of private funding and the need for more representation from people like yourself, like more females, right, who are actually writing checks and things like that. So as an entrepreneur, as a founder, how do you recommend navigating the fact that there is so little funding, private funding, for women, for health care that's focused on women and solutions around women, and just also the leadership aspect in terms of, not just the funding, but the people actually also like yourself, the venture capitalists and, maybe angels. How do you recommend for entrepreneurs to navigate also the fact that there's less representation in terms of VCs or angel investors who are women?
Oh, gosh. So I think that it's really difficult because we look at allocators in a very traditional sense. So I would say broaden the way that you fundraise and talk to non-traditional allocators. Go ahead and talk to people who have private wealth, family offices. Go talk to people who do alternative strategies, because if it's for women, 51% of the population is a good business model as long as the fundamentals of what you're offering can be very clearly articulated by you as a founder, and you have done the work, right? So I think the second piece is be very prepared, because I have found that, out of the 300 or so companies in women's health that we've looked at, I think that there is more rigor required in making that case despite the fact that the numbers are obvious in terms of population, like the downstream impact of what you're doing, the likelihoods of success, I mean, adoption, forward-looking commercial opportunities, global scale. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but I do think we have to be more rigorous as women. We just do. We just have to be better. I think be persistent. It's really interesting when I put something out there, doing a call for innovation. I get at least 90% more men responding than women.
Always.
And I'm just like, wait, I'm a woman. I'm a friendly person. Come reach out, bring me your innovation. But for whatever reason, like, we wait. We're like, we're not ready yet, or whatever it is, just go do it. If you feel like you're ready, not. Just be as persistent as you possibly can. And I know that those three things are fairly obvious, right? I think those are fairly obvious pieces of advice, but they're just not often done together.
Wait, there's a question. Hi, there, thank you.
So my name is Gorka Chaco. I lead our global life sciences practice at Wipro. First of all, congratulations, great session. So my question is around the fact that you said that women only got participation in clinical trials since 1993. And so, we all know data is historical. And if we're looking at AI, do we think that the bias is going to get added because we're looking at data that's flawed because we don't have data on women pre-1993? However, I'm a person who looks at the glass half full. So so this is the question, is there a way to look at data that can then expedite how we're looking at initiatives for women and not have to go through clinical trials that will move us out of this snail's pace? Because as you said, 51% of the population will go through menopause, as an example. So would love your perspective.
Diana, can we give you that one? Because I think we have to close with that.
I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer that one.
I didn't quite, but what are you trying to get to? Like it wasn't clear what you...
Real world evidence.
Are you talking about real world evidence? Absolutely.
Yeah. The fact that you only have it from 1993, what are the creative ways to leverage it so that we don't go into biased model? Because that's the risk.
Honestly, I think without anything pre-1993 that you're looking at, I'm not sure there's a way, right? Because you simply do not have the data. That said, when it comes to use of those products, that's a different story, right? Ambien, let's use Ambien. Tons of women are using Ambien now, and you can certainly use real-world evidence there to look at, various aspects of the drug.
And there's a real effort to define common data elements to make it easier to compare different trials around the world and get your larger data sets so that you can get more statistical power. But it's going to be difficult in the pre-electronic health record era because just reading some of those records and then transmitting them into an electronic health record is quite difficult.
So I have the unfortunate responsibility to close our panel almost on time, and I really think this has been a tremendous panel. We have one very short video that we want to close with, which really I think recaptures the global importance of what we're talking about and the global effort that's underway. So please thank my panel now, and then we will. Thank you. Fantastic. And then can you play the video, please?
Hello, everyone. This is Shyam Bishen, head of the Center for Health and Healthcare at the World Economic Forum. I am thrilled to see Galien Foundation's focus on scientific innovation that improves the state of human health, which very well aligns with the mission of Center for Health and Healthcare at the World Economic Forum, where we aim to identify and scale up solutions for more resilient, efficient, and equitable healthcare systems to deliver the best possible care and keep people healthy across societies and nations. We believe that science and technology are shaping the future of health and healthcare and we all have a role to play to ensure healthier outcomes for everyone. We are thrilled to see generational health featured at the Galien Forum. As leaders in healthcare and life sciences, it is now time for us to take actions for our generations. Never before had generational health been more important as it connects the critical discussions around climate and health, women's health, and global health equity that are taking place now. With our partners at Tower Capital, we are focused on accelerating the public and private dialogue, in particular toward improving funding for women's health. Your tireless efforts in bringing new and innovative therapeutics in order to improve the overall state of health are commendable. There is so much for you to be proud of. We honor all the nominees for their perseverance in the innovation of science for humanity. Thank you for the opportunity to share our vision and thoughts here, and all the best.
Economic Forum for their support, and also thanks again to the panel and to all of you for hosting us here today. We got a lot of work to do. I also remind you that the concurrent sessions will begin. Topics are climate change and health, PBMs, pricing access, and the global supply chain. So pick your room and enjoy the rest of the conversation this morning. Thank you. Thank you.